So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name's Tony Mannion. I'm Sales Development Manager at SolutionsPT. And today's webinar is the 5 most important aspects of threat detection today. So we've muted microphones so that we don't get any background noise, but do feel free to ask questions through the chat function, and I'll be checking that throughout the presentation. So hopefully we can get back to any questions that you have. So I'm joined today by Lee Carter, who's Cybersecurity Product Manager at SolutionsPT. And also, good morning, Lee, good afternoon. And Gary Kneeland, who's the Channel Program Technical Director at Claroty. And it is morning for you, Gary, so thank you for joining us.
Not a problem, happy to be here.
Great. So the reason for the webinar today, the feedback I get from a lot of customers that I speak to is that they don't always have the same level of visibility at an OT network as they would do for their IT environment. But actually they are seeing an increase in the IT-OT convergence, and with digitization, the need to incorporate process data into the corporate systems for analysis, then the governance of both systems should be as important as each other. I think as well, during the current situation, many companies are relying on more people connecting remotely to their OT systems, increasing the need to know exactly what's going on. And despite the changes that we've seen and the effect on our working practices, demand hasn't gone away, and in many cases, it's actually increased. So our customers still need to produce. The other important aspect that I believe in threat detection is it's not only about bad actors. We also always talk about bad actors and the threats, but actually it's also very good at avoiding human error. I know of a company recently that renamed their servers, but they forgot to tell the system integrator who was managing their system. Because they were working remotely, it wasn't very easy for them to pick it up, whereas on site, it would have been something that would probably be mentioned. It wasn't a happy ending. But with the increased requirement and the interest that we're seeing in threat detection, we find that that's actually being mirrored across the globe. So today we're going to be looking at those important aspects. Before we do that, and as we've done in previous webinars, Lee, we know that cybersecurity strategies depend on multiple levels of protection, and that some companies are at different stages in implementing their strategy. So what sort of things have you been seeing from our customer base?
Okay, thanks, Tony. So what I'm seeing from our customers at the moment is there's a lot of network deployments that we're seeing which are consistent of being multi-homed. Now, these often have devices living on different zones. And unfortunately, some of these span IT and OT, which actually compromise and bypass central firewalls. Now, I know it's not uncommon that we see multi-homed networks in OT, but in today's threat landscape, it's certainly not the best practice. I'm also seeing a general lack of overall cybersecurity maturity. Now, I see some great work from point solutions which are being deployed, but if you start digging a little bit deeper into some of the security fundamentals, there's certain things that are missing, like operating system being hardened, passwords that are being reused, missing patches. Now, again, missing patches isn't something that's uncommon in OT. But what really does seem to trouble me is where we see AV, which is deployed or not deployed, and it's quite often that we see that signatures are out of date, and that just gives a false sense of protection. Now, the good news is I'm starting to see a marked shift from organisations that now they're looking to adopt frameworks. Now that's really, really good. Now, this really helps to outline to customers what good security should look like. And we're seeing standards like IEC 62443 that's being widely implemented, as well as the NCSC's cyber assessment framework. And that's a really big step forward in regulated and non-regulated verticals. I'm unfortunately seeing a wider spread of lack of visibility on general OT. And now this isn't just on assets, this is also about the communication pathways. Now, I mean, for example, the last POC I did, the customer said that they got 300 devices. Now, at the close of the POC, we'd identified nearly twice that. Now, when you start taking into account the communication paths that are going between enterprise devices, those start to really quickly add up.
Really interestingly, and I guess it is a positive that we are seeing that step change with standards compliance and framework compliance, which is really positive. But what sort of concerns are driving that? What are you seeing from our customers from their concerns within cybersecurity?
Well, these are quite varied, actually. Now, for our mature customers, they understand the need for robust security, and they see monitoring as a key component in their defences, and especially those who've got really highly connected operations. As I mentioned previously, there generally is more assets in operation than they actually have on record. Regulated industries, they actually struggle sometimes complying with the cyber assessment framework, and especially for principles C1, which is detecting cyber events, and C2, which is a proactive event discovery. Now, in practice, this often translates for them having a greater emphasis on being reactive to incidents about being proactive. And we all know that an ounce of prevention is far better than a pound of cure. With a recent shift towards remote working, we've seen a number of customers, and they've got some concerns on how they monitor their remote connections, especially for third parties. Now, they would normally come and attend sites, so they're having to work on a VPN, and they don't have the same controls that they'd have in place on a physical site visit, like being able to be escorted and all the things like that. For some of our less mature customers, their biggest concerns are normally about where to start on the cybersecurity journey. Now, I personally see this being related to the OT skills gap, and a lot of this actually originates from a strategic level. Now, many of the engineers, they're very highly skilled, and they focus at the issues at hand. But the skills and knowledge base is really limited to what they know. And it's really, really difficult for them to get a core grasp and understanding of the three core aspects: people, process, and technology. Engineers generally focus on technology alone, and we know there is no single solution that you can put into place. Universally, I'd say asset identification is common, and being able to identify when unauthorized changes have taken place. There's a disconnect between change management, the process of what you should change and what actually happens in the real world. Now, what I say to our customers, I summarize cybersecurity in 5 simple steps. I say be able to identify your assets, apply appropriate security measures based on assessed risk, make systems difficult to compromise but frictionless to use, understand compromise may happen, so make detection easy, and have a plan B for recovery. And by that, I mean use business disaster recovery and don't just rely solely on backups.
Thanks, Lee. Made a really important point about compromise may happen, and that's despite all the best attempts in the system. And looking at our blogs and newsletters, even just over the last 6 months, we've been talking about zero-day events for OT and Windows, things like Ripple 20, zero logons, SIGRED, that have been around for a long, long time and are still having an effect on our systems today. And Gary, I mentioned earlier on about we have seen globally, and speaking to yourself, you mirror this, the interest in threat detection. So from the purposes of today, we said that we'd look at the 5 main aspects. What aspects have you identified that are important to your customers?
Yeah, definitely. And thank you for the intro there. So yeah, we have actually absolutely seen that same thing. Some of the same things Lee has been talking about on requiring threat detection. And it's coming from multiple different places. A lot of times customers come to us and it'll be a CISO that got tasked with go do OT security. And that's a lot of stuff, you know, that's a very big problem to try and wrap your arms around. Another thing that we're seeing much more often is regulatory impacts. So we see a lot of regulators pushing for this as well. So depending on what industry you're in, you may have push from the business units forcing you into doing OT security, or having you know, your regulator come in and tell you that you have to go do something. And in all these cases, you know, it's a very large problem. And I really like how Lee categorized this of these simple steps. You know, there's a way that you can go do this, but it can be very difficult when you're actually tackling a real plant environment, especially if you do have systems that are 20, 30 years old, if you do have poor drawings, poor visibility, you know, if you don't really know what's out there, like the path is there, but it can be very difficult to actually get down and start performing it. So that's why I like to talk about the main threat functions and start with that piece on visibility, because while it's not directly, you know, fighting the bad guy, if I don't know that devices exist, I'm never going to be able to effectively combat that threat. Because if there's a place in my network that I don't know it's there, or there's a device in my network that someone can exploit, that's where the attacker is going to come in. So I really need to understand what's in my environment before I can do anything else. And that, I think, is the first step that most of our customers end up taking. That's a lot of times the first step in these projects that we see with OT security, is just trying to wrap our arms around the problem, figure out what we got, figure out the footprint that we're actually dealing with in this space, and start identifying what's out there. Once we start identifying it, the next thing that I normally focus on is OT specific vulnerabilities. So there's a lot of different vulnerabilities in this space that you don't see in the Windows space that we need to take into account. So once I know that we have all these assets, particularly all these OT specific assets, things like PLCs, sensors, RTUs, all that sort of thing, we want to be able to identify exactly what vulnerabilities that we have specifically in the OT space. You know, more and more often, and this is something Tony just touched on, we're seeing attacks that are focused on the OT area. And we need to be able to have a solution that deals with that, that understands these OT specific threats, that is equipped to deal with, you know, the different attack pathways that we have, the different methods of delivering payloads in an OT environment, all this sort of thing. That's a really big thing that we need to focus on. And this is, again, you know, we identify the assets, then we figure out what we can start doing. After that, we can start doing threat detection. So once I identify what exists and I've identified what kind of vulnerabilities I have out there, all of that can feed into effective threat detection. And this is where I'm going to start responding to alerts, you know, be able to find out when the attacker gets in my environment, when they actually start exploiting that system that's out there. This is, I think, the biggest issue is that when we look at the OT space, it's not just throwing in a tool that's going to start alerting us. We need to have something that has all this other stuff baked in, because if I'm missing one of these pieces, again, if I don't know devices exist or I don't know existing vulnerabilities, I'm never going to be able to effectively respond to that alert, because I don't have the whole picture. I don't have the whole system in place in front of me. So I'm not going to be able to effectively do that. And this is all just on the active threat side. Some other things that I think are really important more and more often now are specifically secure remote access. So again, especially now, remote access is just a part of doing business in the OT environment. In the past, it wasn't. You know, people always talked about their air-gapped networks and not having to worry about the pathway into their environment. But nowadays, especially in the current age, people are going to be working remotely, whether it's because they're quarantined or whether it's just because it's a remote site. You know, you need a way to get in and just do business. And this is probably your most open attack pathway, because this is where the outside comes into your environment. This is your most vulnerable area. So we really need to look at a solution that can deal with that remote access and give you all the tools that you need for that OT specific space to be able to monitor and effectively and securely do remote access into this environment. And the final thing I always like to talk about here is just risk compliance and reporting. So, you know, it's great to have all these things. All these things really make up a great program and give you all the tools that you need to do that. But if you can't prove to anyone how you do it, it may as well not exist. So having the ability to actually report out what's going on, being able to show your work is very important, especially if you're in a regulated environment. But even if you're not, your CISO is going to want to go to the board and show them all these fancy things that you've been doing, this, how you're building up your security program. And these are the things that we need to focus on when we're looking at doing this. So what I was going to show off was a quick copy of Claroty's continuous threat detection, our latest build of this software, and kind of talk through how we tackle these different areas. And, from a high level, these are the sort of things that we're looking at within the OT environment. And this is also how Claroty thinks when we're designing our product. So let's go ahead and really quickly look at a system here. Hopefully, am I sharing the right screen, by the way? Is it showing the dashboard right now? Okay.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I wanted to show up the most recent copy of our system, and again, talk to how we're focusing on these specific things. So remember, I talked initially about how a lot of our customers are coming to us and just, they have that giant task, go do OT security. Well, how do we tackle that? Well, we need to split it into manageable chunks. And that's where we start talking about that visibility, that risk and vulnerability, that threat detection. And you can see here in our latest build of Claroty, this is how we actually model our system now. We want to put it into these specific use cases. So as you're building up your security program, as you're starting to work through and become more mature and be able to handle these more advanced things, we can grow with you and do that. So it all starts here with visibility. And this is where you can see some of our new dashboards here. And this is where we're identifying everything that exists within the environment. And again, that's the most important first step with any of these security programs, is you just need to figure out what's out there. What assets do we have? What are they doing? And how are they configured? So do we have PLCs? Do we have RTUs, sensors, engineering workstations, whatever? This is the first step we take whenever we come into any new environment. We want to figure out what's there, start wrapping our arms around the problem, and start showing you all this data. And again, for a lot of our customers, especially the more immature ones, I think Lee was talking about how customers approach him in different levels of maturity in their program. This is always that first step. Regardless of where you're going, regardless of how fancy your IT program is, we need to know what's there. So this is that first step within the OT environment. Then once we've identified that, once we've figured out what exists, we want to start performing risk and vulnerabilities. And this, I think, is one of the most immediate value adds that Claroty brings. This is where I take all that data that I've identified about all your assets, and then I start identifying the existing risk and vulnerabilities. And the nice thing about this is, again, Lee was talking about before, how you have both the reactive and the proactive controls within the environment. Well, the proactive ones can be a lot more effective. I think you mentioned, the ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So if we can go out there and start closing these loopholes, closing these attack pathways before the attacker gets into the environment, that is huge for your security program. And these are the sort of steps that you want to take to better understand your network and just start securing it more. So this is where we take all that visibility information and start giving you the steps that you need to proactively start fixing these problems. You can see some of these down here in our insights, things like assets communicating directly to the external world, things using unsecure protocols, which are just ripe with vulnerabilities and are just waiting to be exploited. Things with unpatched vulnerabilities. Again, I think Lee mentioned before about, having old systems, say you have an AV system out there that's 20 years old, never been patched, that gives you that false sense of security. Here we can actually show you what exists in your real environment based on that rich visibility data that we've already identified. And this allows us to, before we're dealing with a threat, before we even worry about the attacker coming into our environment, start closing these holes, start fixing these issues, and start increasing the security in your environment. And again, you can see how we build our entire system around this. So we want to make it so that we can grow with you and build into these different use cases as your program matures, as you're able to do more with it. So then ultimately, threat detection. All this feeds into the threat detection. And we want to be able to give you the rich information you need to actually be able to respond when the attacker comes into your environment. So that is something that all gets fed from the visibility and the risk and vulnerabilities. Again, if I don't know something exists, I'm not going to be able to effectively do threat detection because that's where the attacker is going to go. You know, if you have a blind spot in your network, that's your most vulnerable place. That's where you don't have visibility, you don't know what's going on. And if something does happen, you're never going to know about it. So we need to know what's out there. And then our risk and vulnerabilities, that lets us tell if you have existing attack pathways. If something does get exploited, you know, why is it happening? And then how we need to respond. You know, if something's happening because of some vulnerability that's on the system, how are we going to respond to it? Do we need to take it offline? Do we need to patch it? Do we need to, you know, put in a firewall rule? All these sort of things. This is the sort of rich information that we want to bring you with your threat detection data. And this is another thing where we can feed into your existing processes. So another big powerful point of Claroty is that we can take all this data that we've identified and feed this into your existing IT system. So if you already have response organizations built, you know, I'm sure on a lot of customers that we have much more mature IT programs than they do their OT security programs. So if you already have incident response teams and you know, ticketing systems and SIMs that you're working with, and SOCs and NOCs and all this sort of stuff, we can take this OT data and feed it straight into that environment so that you can continue working with it. You know, you can immediately start utilizing this, and your time to actual value on this system is very, very low because we can feed into those existing systems. We can start giving our rich data over there and quickly and easily augment what you're seeing there. Another thing that I wanted to point on here is, again, I keep talking about how we try and design Claroty to grow to meet your program. And this investigation feature is one of the newest ones that we've added in our latest release. And this is where we try and identify, again, more of the proactive steps that you can take to start doing things like threat hunting and much more advanced security things. So after you've wrapped your arms around the visibility, the risk and vulnerabilities, and you've started figuring out how to deal with alerts and threats and that sort of thing, then you can start doing some of the fancy stuff that you're doing on your IT environment, where you're going out, you're actually looking for attack pathways, you're doing all the, you know, all the fancy threat hunting stuff that your IT guys get paid all the big bucks for. And this is where you can see things like, we look at things like network sessions and DNS values. This is where I look at every single network session within the system, and I'm able to identify who's communicating with who, and particularly things like retransmission. So this is, you know, bread and butter behavior that you would see if an attacker's in your environment poking around, you know, trying to monitor stuff or scan your environment. This is the sort of stuff that we can identify with this really granular data that we're identifying on your OT network. And again, you can move this from your IT environment where you're doing stuff like this today, and we've helped to kind of demystify that in the OT environment and give you the data that you need to be able to perform these functions and to effectively do these more advanced security functions within your OT space. Another thing that's very important here is that while we do have the traditional IT attack pathways here, we also have OT specific things that we have to worry about. So one of the newest things that we've added here is our process value view. So if you look at the real attacks that occur within the OT environment, typically what happens is it's not like your traditional IT attacks where it's just malware or they're setting up a botnet or something like that. They're actually trying to impact these OT devices in the format that they're looking for. So they want to stop equipment, they want to turn stuff off, they want to, you know, impact the real environment. And the way that they do this is they actually write data to the PLCs or the sensors or, you know, whatever, your actual equipment in the same format that they're looking for. So one of the ways that we're helping to combat this is we're starting to monitor all of the data values within your OT environment. So if you have a tank level that's being set to 10,000 or something like that, we'll actually identify what that tag is, what the values are being written to it, and then automatically create high-low limits for that. So this allows us to start tracking these values and creating alerts, creating monitoring functions around it. Start looking if all of a sudden someone comes in and writes, you know, 20,000 to that tank and it's going to cause it to overflow, we can really easily identify that, show that, and alert that to you. The other thing, again, I talked before, how we feed into your existing IT systems. Well, that's one of the big strengths that we have here. I can take this OT data, this stuff that, again, your traditional IT guys aren't used to dealing with, and I can feed it into your existing incident response stuff. I can feed it into your existing SIM and help demystify that, help make it something that your IT guys can start working with immediately and understand what's happening. So we can take all this you know, rich OT data that we're able to get, and start feeding it into your existing IT processes, get it into something that people are actually going to be able to respond and work with, and handle that whole thing. So this is, again, all this stuff that I've been talking about. This is, kind of building your security program as you're getting through it. And I think these are some of the primary steps in threat detection. Again, getting visibility, identifying risk and vulnerabilities, ultimately doing threat detection with all that data baked into it, and then some of the more advanced investigation features and things like that. But I said before that you're only as good as you can prove. You need to be able to report on this stuff. We need to be able to show what's going on. And that's something that I think Claroty does really well, is that we have lots of different reports automatically built out on a variety of different data within the system. So if you want asset reports, if you want vulnerability reports, all this sort of stuff, we have all this different data that we can capture. Another thing that I think is really powerful that we do is our risk assessment report. And this is something that I know that Tony and Lee and SolutionsPT work a lot with customers to get this sort of thing, because it is a snapshot in time on the current health of your system. And so if you're in a POC environment, or even something like if we just take a packet capture from your environment, we can really quickly get a footprint on what exists, what do we have, and what are some of the key things that we need to look at. So what this risk assessment report is, it does a very granular analysis of your entire OT environment and tries to pull out some of the key indicators, the key data that you would care about and you would want to start digging into. So it starts here with the hygiene score, and that is just a quantitative score on what your current network state is. Do we have a lot of vulnerabilities? Do we have a lot of issues? Do we have remote access issues or something like that? Do I have stuff talking directly out to the internet? All of these sort of things we're identifying here, and we're starting to show you how you're doing against your environment. And then we give you lots of different metrics here on things like just what your assets are. How many different types of assets I have, what types of assets are they, what is my breakdown of assets? Do I have a lot of IoT devices, OT devices? What are they actually doing? Give you a breakdown on vendors. Then we actually give you things like your network map, actually showing where your communication is, particularly on the OT space. Who is talking to my OT devices? Who is actually interacting with my PLCs? Do I have some random laptop on my corporate network trying to come down and change stuff on my production floor? These are the sort of things that you want to care about, and you need to really quickly be able to understand. Then the other thing that we look at is we look at all of these vulnerabilities, any issues that we've identified, and give you a very high level hit list on some of the key things that you want to start focusing on in your environment. So again, things like PLCs talking to other things, unsecure protocols. If we have specifically risky assets, my environment here in this demo is kind of small, but when you get into a real plan and you have thousands or tens of thousands of assets, being able to get an ordered list of who we need to go tackle first can be really nice to have. It can make it very easy to start actually trying to deal with these issues. So again, I think, this really talks a lot to how Lee talked about those simple steps that we can take. Well, getting into reality and actually being able to implement those versus knowing what to do, I think, are two very different things. So I think that's one of the strengths of the Claroty platform, is that we can take these steps. It's not a mystery on what we need to do within the OT environment to effectively do security. We just need the right data. We need the right information. We need it in the right place, and we need it in the right form factor to be able to enact on it. So I think Claroty is able to do that with the visibility that we bring and the data that we're able to do, especially on these proprietary OT devices. And then we can present it in the way that you need, whether it's in your existing SIMs and your existing CMDBs, whatever your existing data are in your existing workflows. We can go into that so that you can immediately start using it and right out of the gate start enacting on it. Another thing that I think we focus on a lot is the proactive steps to fix things. Again, we really want to focus on things that can buy you security today rather than waiting for the attacker to come exploit it. So those are all steps that we can take to start doing those functions. So I wanted to end here just really quickly on, I've talked a lot about the CTD platform. Another thing that Claroty does now is actually our secure remote access solution. And in our most recent build, we've actually added in functionality between CTD and SRA. So what CTD is doing is it's monitoring the network. SRA is an OT specific function to actually allow remote access into the OT environment. And with our most recent build, I think it covers the two primary use cases that we see. So again, we want to be able to monitor the network. We want to give visibility in the network. CTD gets us all of that. But we still want to be able to do remote access. Again, it's a part of doing business today, and we need to be able to do it in a secure and functional way. So with the combination of the Claroty Secure Remote Access and the Claroty CTD, it gives us full visibility into who's coming in from the outside. It allows us to control what they're doing, what they're interacting with, and how they're interacting with these systems. And then CTD gives us full visibility on what's actually happening within the environment. So I think it gives us, the full gamut of what we actually need within the OT space to perform this function. So I wanted to pass it back over. I think I've talked a little bit about some of the primary functions and within the various systems.
Thanks, Gary. That was really useful and really exciting to see some of the developments there as well. I think the one thing that really comes over to me is that visibility of assets, of vulnerabilities, of real information about your OT network is important throughout your cybersecurity maturity and your journey. So at the very beginning, it can help prioritize what the next step should be. And then as you get more and more comfortable with using the tool, actually being able to start proactively looking for those risks and being able to manage those. So I think whether it's just knowing where your assets are, understanding what they're doing to comply with regulation or corporate standards, or just to recover from an incident, it's a tool that really is adding value to anybody from a cybersecurity perspective. I think the other thing is that it's a tool that's built for OT. So actually the information you're getting through is more contextualized. The alerts include information that an OT engineer would understand and be able to investigate, less false positives, as we've seen with some other tools that have been introduced to an OT environment. And that's actually going to help protect probably one of our most valuable commodities, time. Time is really important to all of our customers. Very often, this isn't a separate job to the day job. I think the other thing for me is coupled with the current change in our working practices, we are seeing this interest increasing globally. And I think when you're not always able to be on site, or the people managing and maintaining your systems are not on site, then a single view of what's happening on the network is essential. And I think coupling this with the secure remote access is a very, very important point to make. We wouldn't allow people to walk onto our sites to make changes without having a robust process in place to be able to manage that. Sometimes we can allow that remotely by not having the right processes in place. The other thing is, you mentioned sort of nearer the end there about the integration into other tools. And that's hugely important with any cybersecurity solution. Not only do our customers not have the resource to search multiple areas for information, but the truth is that in the event of an incident, you just don't have the time. You do have to act quickly. So for many of our customers, an important step is evaluating a threat detection system is to actually understand that the data that they'll see and how they can use it to protect their systems. And this is something we've been able to help a number of customers with by running either a proof of concept, or, as Gary mentioned before, being able to take the packet capture, take that snapshot, and be able to show what data and vulnerabilities are being identified. And that's not only important to understand how we'll use the tool, but it's also important to understand how we're going to get buy-in from the rest of the company. We know that budgets are tight. We know that people are having to fight for money. and being able to show what benefits you would be expecting to get from a cybersecurity spend, again, is a huge way of being able to bring the business with you. So we are going to send out details of how to get in touch, along with a link to the recording of the webinar, so that you can share it with other stakeholders in your organization. And we will include details there of email addresses, how to come back to talk to us with any questions you may have, either on CTD or on any of the cybersecurity aspects that you've got. I've just checked, there haven't been any questions, which is either a good sign that we've covered off all the elements that people wanted to see. If there are any questions, please feel free to email them to us afterwards if you haven't had time to ask during the webinar. And it only leaves for me really to thank Gary and Lee for fantastic content today, and really interesting discussion. To thank people for setting a time aside to the time to come and join us today. And we look forward in seeing you at our next cybersecurity webinar. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.